coming up on today's halftime broadcast.
And if you don't have any goals, you don't have any standards, you haven't set any boundaries, you haven't set any expectations, then what happens is you're susceptible to other people's opinions about your marriage.
When you're comparing your life to something that's fictitious, then it can lead you in a state of depression. It can lead you to developing unhealthy patterns of thought. It can lead you to developing unhealthy patterns and standards of behavior in your relationship.
So we're modeling our marriage after the image of people in our lives instead of modeling our marriage after the image of Christ.
And now, today's Bible teaching with Tony Emmahale, pastor of Braveheart United.
Top of the day to you, and thank you for tuning in to today's broadcast of Halftime. I am so delighted that you have taken time out of your day to be a part of this halftime broadcast. As you know, we are in the midst of a marriage and relationship series entitled When the Vow Breaks. This is our annual series, and this week we have none other than Suzan Stroud, author extraordinaire, the best-selling author of I Am Not Successful Because I Don't Want to Be. She is one of the 2017 TEDTalk finalists, and during that time her speech was The Gift of No. Also the author of Life Diet 365. And Suzan, she's definitely no stranger to the airwaves. And today she's going to share with us some pertinent details and tips that you can apply to your relationship now in order to sustain a successful future. Strengthen that bond in your marriage or your personal relationships of intimacy if it's someone that you're desiring to be in that marital relationship with. And today we're going to focus on the concept of what is stranger than friction in our relationship. Suzan, welcome.
Thank you, Tony. I am so excited to be on the show with you today, and I thank you for sharing me with your listeners.
Hey, well, listen, that's what we do. You and I have been kicking these rocks for a long time together.
Yes, we have. Yes, we have. I love you dearly.
Yes, you know I love you too. So I knew that when I started thinking about putting together this discussion on what's stranger than friction, particularly as it relates to marital relationships, I had to get someone that would be real, earnest, truthful, and sometimes the truth hurts. But as I know you and how deeply I know you, that has never stopped you from coming forth with the truth and real talk. So I am so encouraged today to have real talk with you on this particular subject. Now, those of you who are listening, if you haven't already, go ahead and get your note-taking utensils and devices ready, because we're getting ready to go into some real talk situation with Suzan Stroud. So when you hear this, stranger than friction, what comes to mind?
Well, first of all, I thought it was such a funny title, and I said, and I know it didn't take Tony a minute to come up with that title. But, you know, the thing about it is when you think about friction, you know, many people in relationships, they want to avoid friction. They would rather pretend that things are going well, or just kind of, you know, skirt over things and just pretend that something doesn't exist because they don't want to deal with the real concerns. I don't like to use the word issues. They don't like to deal with the real concerns that they're facing in the relationship at the present time.
And that's absolutely correct. A lot of times when they do that, it's because they don't want to be responsible for resolving the friction.
Absolutely, because, you know, I believe, and I say this, like you said, you know me, and I'm very transparent, you know, about my marriage. I've done a YouTube video about it, you know, just saying, hey, you know what, you have to be real and you have to deal with the issues and the concerns. I say, hey, I'm no relationship guru, but what I do know is what I know about my marriage and what works and what doesn't work. And I'm a communicator. And being a communicator, I don't want to walk around with us not speaking and, halfway, having conversations, not sharing our marital bed, and, just all kinds of things that can come in between unresolved concerns.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Basically, when it comes to people avoiding the friction, it sounds like you're saying that there are 3 reasons why they would avoid frictions or how they avoid the friction. Number 1 is that they will pretend that things are going well. Mm-hmm. Number 2 is that they will tend to skirt over the issues as opposed to addressing the issues. And number 3 is because there is a fear of addressing the real issues because they don't want to find themselves in conflict. Would that be accurate?
That's very accurate, because one of the things that, and I just happened to have attended a wedding this weekend, a very beautiful wedding. And what happens, we get caught up and we're excited about the wedding because the wedding, planning of the wedding itself is fun. For us ladies, we're picking out dresses and venues and who's going to be our attendees, and, the fellas, they're doing their thing. But we're all caught up in the planning of the wedding, and no one ever really delves down and sits down and have conversations about what happens after we walk down that aisle holding hands as man and wife, and we're presented at the reception. Our guests go home. We go on our honeymoon, and then we get home and real life begins. Very few people have the conversation beyond the planning point. And so that's how you end up, in these situations where you're pretending that things are going well, and you're skirting over issues and your fear of addressing because, hey, we spent the whole year having fun sitting and planning the wedding and what colors and what venue and the flowers and the food and the family coming, invitations, and we didn't deal with the rest of our life.
And
you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. Isn't that in and of itself the thing or the element of being that it's strange to basically settle for something less in your marriage because you're avoiding the friction. And so the strange thing is existing in a relationship, a marital relationship that's dysfunctional. And that dysfunction becomes your norm. So
it's very normal.
Yeah, the consequence then for the pretending, skirting over issues, avoiding the conflict, avoiding the responsibility to resolve the conflict, the consequence, as you had mentioned earlier, was the not speaking, the lack of communication. You spoke about sleeping in separate beds. So now we're encroaching on that lack of intimacy. The lack of closeness, the lack of trust, the lack of security, and the lack of that emotional tank being filled between husbands and wives.
You're absolutely right. And you know how these things creep in because we will have a goal for high school. We'll have a goal for college. We have goals for what we want to do beyond college, what's our career, where we want to be successful, where we want to live, and things of that nature. But many couples do not come together and say, what is the goal for our marriage? What is our purpose? Because we've gotten so caught up in the planning and the fun and the beauty of it that we forget that our marriage still has a purpose under the umbrella of God's word. And because we have no goal, we don't understand the purpose of our marriage, because many of us don't understand that our families have a purpose. When you look at when you read the Bible and you look at the different stories and the characters that we're so enamored with, their families had a purpose. You had sheep herders, you had tax collectors, you had fishermen, you had all kinds of people, and those families had goals and they had purposes, and the family knew what they were supposed to do. We don't know what we're supposed to do, so once we leave the wedding chapel, nobody knows what's supposed to happen beyond that because we've been so busy planning for the event.
That's good stuff right there. I hope you all have got that. Those of you who are taking notes, if you're not able to keep up with the discussion, know that this broadcast is going to be available for you 24/7 online. So go back very slowly and methodically and listen to and capture these nuggets. And what Suzan just said is she gave us some hints as to how these things subtly creep in. And the basis of that is because we enter into marriage without being goal-oriented. For marriage to be such an important and critical station of life, it amazes me how we put that lack of focus on setting a goal with regard to the purpose of our marriage, unlike, like you mentioned, the purpose of education, high school, college, career. But when it comes to marriage, we don't have plans for our family. You know, I know years ago, John Eric and I used to sit down every couple of years or so, and we would put together a family plan. We would refine it. Now, it's been a couple of years or so since we've done it recently, but nonetheless, we're planning in other ways for the family. But if you're not intentional, then you leave yourself open for the devil to come in and wreak havoc in your relationship. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree, because when you don't have a goal and you don't understand your purpose and other people get in your ear, you are liable to be swayed in all types of directions, because now people are on the outside looking in, figuring how they think your marriage should be. And if you don't have any goals, you don't have any standards, you haven't set any boundaries, you haven't set any expectations, then what happens, you're susceptible to other people's opinion about your marriage, which leads into something else that before I lose this thought, when we think about the word imagination and you look at the beginning of that, it's image. So we're modeling our marriage after the image of people in our lives instead of modeling our marriage after the image of Christ.
Amen. I see that a lot with entertainment and movies. And in fact, I was actually having a conversation with John Eric just the other day just about how Hollywood paints this picture of what love should look like. And a lot of people experience disappointments in their marriage because it doesn't look like it looks on the TV screen. It doesn't look like it looks on the silver screen in the movie. And when you're comparing your life to something that's fictitious, then it can lead you in a state of depression. It can lead you to developing unhealthy patterns of thought. It can lead you to developing unhealthy patterns and standards of behavior in your relationship. And it can lead you to developing unrealistic expectations with regard to the level of intimacy even that you experience in your relationship.
Absolutely. And you touched on something when you said Hollywood, is pretty much defining, so to speak, what marriage is supposed to look like, because so many people are watching these reality shows. But when you think about it, that seed started years ago with soap operas. Because and since the dynamic of our family structure has changed, because, see, when the soap operas were out, they were targeting the moms who were at home taking care of the children. So now mom is at home watching the soap operas and looking at all of these love stories and going out to fancy dinners and parties and dressing up and children being taken care of by someone else. Back in that era, women were wanting their marriages to look like the soap operas. Well, now, since the average woman is out in the workforce, there's no one really sitting at home watching a soap opera. So now they catch you in the evening with the reality shows.
Yeah.
And that's the workshop. That's the idol workshop.
It is. And here's the thing. I don't do reality shows, and the reason why I don't do them is because people think that they're based on reality, and they don't understand that those shows are staged.
They are staged. Absolutely.
They're very much staged. The actors are staged, and they're told to create drama to increase ratings. So
exactly, and you sit and watch that. It's not real. It's not real. It's
staged. And so you in your real life basing your happiness and the level of joy that you experience in your relationship off of some fictitious image of what marriage should look like, as opposed to going to the Word of God and seeing what God's purpose is for marriage.
Absolutely.
What He
Absolutely.
desires. And when we do that, then we can begin to experience the blessings that come from a marriage that has been committed to God.
Absolutely.
A marriage where you're not just in covenant with one another, but there's a three-way covenant with God as the center, God as the head of the marriage. So you're not just connected to one another, which that's all the world really speaks of, is let's get connected with each other. They don't speak to the deep level of intimacy, being purpose-driven in your purpose for your union as the Bible does. And that's a lot of what we're missing in the marital relationships, where people either they stay there in that dysfunction and they die bitter, or they leave it too soon without ever realizing the joy that God had connected to it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you just touched on something when you talked about, because when we allow friction to enter into our marriage, so now we're just kind of avoiding conflict. So now we're avoiding conflict, but what each person in the relationship doesn't understand is, as long as you're having inner turmoil, conflict is existing. It's just not audible. So now you're angry with your spouse. You're having animosity. And then all of these other things can seep in. And like I said earlier, now other people are getting in your ear. And now the reality shows are getting in your ear. And when you talk about, basing it on the Word of God, as far as, speaking from the female perspective, and you and I've had this conversation before, these television programs are even telling women to get away from submission, because the world and society has twisted submission and made it such an ugly term, and women have bought into that.
That's right.
They bought into that. And so now you go in thinking that my marriage is supposed to be 50-50, and one of the things I talked about in my video is, like, marriage is never 50-50. It is never 50-50, because somebody is always going to be doing more at certain stages of the marriage. And when you are in direct alignment with your purpose and your goal that God has established for you and your family, then you understand that and you do what needs to get done to make the marriage better.
That's right. There's a quote that's been pinned out there, certainly not mine, and it's, "He who controls the printed page controls the thinking of the age." So even when it comes to marriage now, and that printed page is basically talking about who controls the media, who controls the airwaves, if you will. And so now what you find is, because everything that you find in media, i.e. the printed page now, is definitely against man-woman marital relationships as defined by God in accordance to His Word. But you now start allowing other things to creep in there. But then you also have behind that the dysfunctional relationships that they show through media that begin to permeate, and now it desensitizes you to what's functional. You begin to see things like open marriage as an acceptable norm, when really that's an anomaly. But so now what it begins to do is erode at your embedded beliefs that were once there based on the Word, and now your embedded beliefs are shaped and formed based on what you see in media, okay? And once those embedded beliefs become to be internalized, now you start acting it out in your own relationship. And that's where, again, you begin, I'm not even going to have this conversation with him, or I'm not going to have this conversation with her. It's not worth it. I'm going to go out here and get mine. And now you're operating in that dysfunction, because you're not even, friction to me is a healthy builder in marital relationships, because as long as it's there and you're working through it openly and honestly with each other, there's hope for your marriage.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that is good stuff. And I had this thing come to me as you were speaking, and I don't know how many listeners I'm speaking to at this point. There are marriages, because there's friction and there's lack of communication, someone steps out in the marriage. They step out, there's an infidelity that occurs. Even through an infidelity, that does not mean that your marriage is over. Some people think that, when there's an infidelity that their marriage is over, because God can work through anything that happens. Because if you're standing at the altar and you're saying, God has joined us together, and we're, what is a threefold coil, we're talking about being joined and being a union, and then the sight of one thing happening, that's an instant deal breaker. Now, I'm sure that there are other factors that may play into, an infidelity, and if there's abuse, we don't support that. But what I'm suggesting is sometimes there are things that happen that makes the marriage repairable. And you have to go back and look at what we spoke about earlier. Were we pretending that things were going well? Were we just kind of skirting over the issues and didn't want to talk through things, and a lack of communication? And so sometimes you kind of have to step back and say, what was my contribution to it getting to this point? Do I condone what happened? Absolutely not. So how do we come together and make this work? Because God is using even that mess for a message for another couple. Because our marriage is our ministry to other people.
They really are. And as long as the two of you are together, even in that state of friction that you both know exists, but as long as the two are willing to work toward bringing resolution and understanding to it, correcting the behavior, correcting the problem that led to it. Because a lot of times you'll hear about indiscretions that have taken place in a marriage, and it's easy to focus on the end result or the bad decision that one person made to step outside of the relationship. Right. But if you get down to the core of the issue, it was typically a communications issue.
Absolutely.
Or someone's emotional tank was not being filled, or someone was looking for the other person to feel their happiness in such a way that only God can feel, and so they found themselves going outside the marriage by subtle luring from other devices that Satan put in their life. It's a difference between a trial and a temptation. The trial is a lesson, but the temptations that come to you are meant to destroy you. Temptation comes in your marriage to destroy your marriage, i.e. infidelity, i.e. lying, cheating, stealing,
that is some good stuff
putting
right
your family at jeopardy, risking the security of your family. But trials in your marriage, they do come, and they teach you something about yourself first, about your spouse next, and about your marriage, and how you need to surrender that to God. Okay? So when we talk about friction, it's not always unhealthy. It becomes unhealthy when you don't discuss it and you don't work through it.
Absolutely.
And so,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I said what I said because there was a time that I didn't believe that a marriage can survive infidelity until I absolutely met someone who went through an infidelity, and her husband, it was sex addiction, which he brought into the marriage. So that's key. You got to know what's coming into the marriage. And when she found out that there was the sex addiction after 13 years of marriage and then infidelity, she wanted to leave, and she cried on her pillow, and she said she audibly heard God say, "Stay." And she has told her story, and from that, she and her husband have been able to come together, and now they're marriage mentors. And that made a believer out of me that any infidelity that someone has, God can use that message for the greater good. And so I want to make sure that got out to your listeners, because sometimes people think that it's the end, and many times it's not.
Here's the thing. It's both men and women, because infidelity happens on both sides of the track. Okay?
It sure does.
It does. It happens on both sides of the track, because there are always going to be those temptations out there that are meant to destroy you, destroy everything that you've worked so hard for, and that's exactly what it's supposed to do. But you have to be in tune to what's going on in your marriage and stop taking your spouse for granted both sides of the table. And, and like the word says, dwell with them according to knowledge. Do you know your spouse? And what is it that you think you know? I mean, because a lot of times we're living with them and it's, hello, dear, goodbye, dear, as they walk out the door to go to work. They come in, you eat dinner together, and then you sit in front of the TV, but there's very little getting to know each other. Unlike
no engagement.
You were dating, because the man that I was dating back in my 20s is not the man that I'm living with now in my 50s. Okay?
Right.
He has changed over time. So I have to invest time in getting to know this man daily as he has changed year after year. That's now, at the core, that's John Eric Imahale. Love him. I loved him then, love him even more now, and will love him even more in the future. But the John Eric Imahale that I first met, to the one that I married, to the one that I'm with now, is a different man. He's grown over time. But if I am not investing in him, the time into him to get to know him, then I'm not going to see the sign of temptation in his life.
Right.
Okay? I'm not going to be able to distinguish between a trial and a temptation in his life.
And listeners, let me share with you, the Tony that John Eric started dating in the 20s is not the same. So let's talk about that on both sides. And she's had to do some changing, and he's watched her change. But the thing about it is that if John Eric was willing to commit to that Tony, he was willing to grow with her and build a life with her and build a family. So it goes both ways. And everybody's not going to change at the same time, because I'm quite sure that John started changing a little bit before you, because you were just, you're saying, hey, we're stubborn souls, you and I. And we understand, because we have very good husbands. We both have very good husbands. We understand, you know what, this is a gem that I have, and if I don't get my act together, this person's not going to put up with me. And so that person, like you said, we dated. Yeah, we dated, and we have to accept that we are all going to change as we grow. And then as we grow and as we get together and we go through these different stages of friction, because every time you have, a conversation over a concern, you grow from that. And then as you progress in the years, well, what you decided to do in year 1 through 3 may have changed in year 13 through 15. And it's all for the better.
Amen.
So friction is good, and I'm so glad that you're having this conversation, because so many people avoid it because they think that they're sparing conflict. They want to keep the peace. They say keep the peace, but yet you're having inner turmoil. Have the conversation. Keep the communication open. And ladies, don't try to have the conversation with your man when he's in the midst of something that he enjoys, whether he likes fishing, watching sports, or whatever. Have a planned time to have that conversation. Nothing will annoy your husband more than trying to have a serious conversation with him while he's having a wind down moment. That's not fair to him.
That is so true. So we beg the question, what's stranger than friction? Operating in dysfunction as a norm and settling for less in your marriage when God has promised you more. With that said, Suzan, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that we have had some great dialogue here, and I'm just hoping that your listeners will go back and listen to this over and over again, and then do some reflecting in their own relationship. And don't try to change the other person. Focus on changing yourself, and as you change, you'll notice that they're evolving as well, and before you know it, you'll have this beautiful flower of purpose that's out there changing destinies in other couples' lives.
Amen. Amen. Well, that's it. It's a wrap. Until we meet again, on next week, we're going to talk about when experience meets expectation. Hang on to your seats, because, it's going to be a round table with several wives, and we're going to talk about when experience meets expectation. Okay? Suzan, thank you so much for sharing this time with us today.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Amen. Oh, it's been such a blessing, such a blessing. So until we meet again, top of the day to you.
You are listening to Halftime with Tony Imahel, pastor of Braveheart United. Today's broadcast has been brought to you by Next Level Plus Project Management and Business Consultants. Learn more about how Next Level Plus can help you solve the right problems and seize the right opportunities by calling 704-780-2997 or visit their website at nextlevelplus.org.